Every wound tells a story.
The moment I stepped into that Massachusetts courtroom, my mother rolled her eyes. Not subtly either. The kind of exaggerated, performative eye roll that says everything she doesn't have the courage to speak aloud. It was her signature move, the "here we go again" gesture she'd perfected over decades of turning herself into the victim of her own stories. My father, Brian Carter, sat beside her. Polished suit, expensive tie, and that same detached smirk he wore at every hockey press conference back in his prime. They looked like the picture of controlled composure, certain they were walking into another moment of sympathy. But then, Judge Alan Reeves froze mid-shuffle through his stack of case files. His gaze lifted and his eyes locked on mine, recognition dawning like a lightning strike. He set his pen down slowly. "Wait," he said, voice lowering, deliberate. "These allegations are against you? You're the defendant?" I could almost hear my mother's breath catch. My parents turned toward each other, confusion flickering across their faces. They had no idea, no clue who I'd become or what I'd spent the last decade doing. And honestly, that made what came next almost poetic. Because I wasn't just the daughter they'd abandoned 32 years ago. I was Assistant District Attorney Emily Carter, Senior Prosecutor for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the woman who'd spent her career putting manipulators and con artists, exactly like them, behind bars. Let me take you back 32 years. I was only 3 months old when my mother, Laura Carter, decided motherhood wasn't for her. She was 18, fresh out of high school in Newton, Massachusetts, the kind of girl who craved the flash of cameras, the validation of attention. My father, Brian, was 21, a rising star on the Boston Bruins development roster, already being called the next big thing. And me? I was the noise they didn't plan for, the screaming interruption in their perfect, curated lives. So they did what selfish people always do. They found someone else to carry the burden of their choices. One cold October morning, they drove me across the state and left me on the doorstep of my grandparents' house in Brookline. My mother said she'd be back after things calmed down. They never did. My earliest memory is of standing on a wooden stool in Grandma Evelyn's kitchen. I must have been 4. I was covered in flour, dumping half a bag of chocolate chips into cookie dough. She just laughed, never scolded, never sighed, and said, "The best cookies always have a little too much of everything, especially love." Grandpa, Judge Richard Carter, would come home still wearing his Supreme Court robes. He'd lift me into his arms, flour and all, and ask, "So, counselor, what's your case today?" And I'd tell him about ants or clouds or my drawings, and he'd listen, truly listen, like I was arguing before the highest court in the state. They never said a bad word about my parents. Not once. When I asked, "Why didn't Mom and Dad live with us?" Grandma would give me that soft, sad smile. "They're busy with important things, sweetheart." I believed her, for a while, because kids always believe kind people. But I wasn't stupid. By the time I was 8, I'd already noticed that other kids' parents showed up for soccer games, that friends talked about family trips and Thanksgiving dinners, while my holidays were just me, Grandma, and Grandpa watching old movies and eating her roast chicken at exactly 6 o'clock. The few times Laura showed up, she looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog. Designer coat, manicured nails, perfume that filled the whole room. She'd kiss the air near my cheek and spend the rest of the visit scrolling her phone, talking about nothing that mattered. Meanwhile, Brian would stay outside, honking the car horn if she took too long. The few times Grandpa dragged him in, the tension was thick enough to taste. He never respected Brian. Not for his career, not for his excuses, not for abandoning his own child. But here's what almost no one knew, not even me, until years later. For over 20 years, Grandpa sent Laura $3,000 every single month. Every single month. That's more than $800,000 gone to someone who gave back nothing. No visits, no calls, no gifts, just empty promises and new requests whenever Brian's latest business venture failed. When Grandma Evelyn died suddenly, it was Thanksgiving weekend. I was 18. One minute she was outside planting tulip bulbs for spring. The next she collapsed in the garden. No warning, no goodbye. I drove 6 hours home from Boston University, crying the entire way. When I pulled up to the house, Grandpa was sitting on the porch, still wearing his gardening gloves, holding a handful of unplanted bulbs. We sat there together in silence until the sky began to lighten, neither of us speaking because there wasn't anything left to say. That was the night I learned grief doesn't make noise. It just sits beside you, heavy, constant, breathing with you. Laura and Brannan showed up at the funeral in matching black outfits like it was some red carpet event. They stayed through the service, accepted condolences like actors in a play, then disappeared before the reception even began. That was the moment I stopped making excuses for them. That was the day I realized some people don't fail you once. They fail you repeatedly until you finally stop giving them the chance to do it again. After Grandma died, Grandpa and I became partners in survival. Sunday dinners became sacred. Sometimes we made her old pot roast recipe. Sometimes we just ordered pizza and ate straight from the box while watching black and white movies. He'd tell me stories from his years on the Massachusetts Supreme Court about justice, about empathy, about using power responsibly. He wasn't just teaching me about law. He was teaching me how to stay human in a system designed to strip that away. By the time I graduated from Boston University Law School, he was in the front row with his ancient tape recorder recording every second. My parents sent a card that said, "Good job, proud of you." 2 sentences, no signatures, no call. I stopped expecting more long before that. Grandpa pulled strings and vouched for me personally when I applied to the district attorney's office. He told them, "She's not a favor, she's a force. Give her a case and she'll show you." He was right. Within 5 years, I was handling high-profile corruption cases that made the Boston Globe. By 30, I was one of the youngest senior prosecutors in the state. My life became a cycle of late nights, cold coffee, and courtroom adrenaline. No dating, no distractions, just justice, and Sunday dinners with Grandpa. Those dinners were non-negotiable. No matter how tired I was, I showed up, and so did he, always. He slowed down in his 80s, but never missed a meal, never missed a story, until the day he couldn't come anymore. He passed in his sleep at 87, in that same Brookline house where he'd raised me. When I found him, he looked peaceful, like someone who'd finally closed every open case in his life. The will reading was held a week later, in an office on Street Street that smelled like polished oak and quiet authority. I went in expecting a few sentimental things, maybe his watch, some books, an old briefcase. What I got instead changed everything. Mr. Daniels, the estate attorney, adjusted his glasses and said, "Your grandfather left his entire estate, the Brookline house, investments, savings, and insurance, to you, Miss Carter. The total valuation stands at roughly $3 million. For a second, I couldn't even process it. $3 million? My throat tightened as I asked, He left everything to me?" Mr. Daniels nodded. "Yes, with one note, a sealed letter addressed to you." He handed me an envelope with Grandpa's familiar handwriting. I opened it carefully. "My dearest Emily, you earned this, not through blood, but through love. You showed up. You stayed when others left. You gave me peace after your grandmother was gone. Never doubt your worth. Love, Grandpa. Tears blurred the ink. It wasn't the money that broke me. It was the validation. He'd seen me. All those nights, all those dinners, every quiet moment. He'd noticed it all. Then Mr. Daniels handed me a second envelope, thick, heavy, filled with documents. It contained 20 years of bank statements showing the payments he sent my mother. $3,000 every single month. Letters from Laura asking for more. Text messages from Brian promising to visit next month. Emails full of excuses. And at the bottom of the folder, a note written by Grandpa. If anyone tries to challenge this, let the truth speak louder than their guilt. 30 days later, my phone rang. It was my attorney, Michael Dunn.
Emily, he said carefully, your parents just filed a lawsuit. They're contesting the will, claiming you manipulated your grandfather, that he was incompetent when it was written. I laughed. I couldn't help it. The irony was almost beautiful. The same people who'd vanished for 3 decades were accusing me of manipulation. The prosecutor who'd spent her career exposing frauds like them. Which brings us back to that courtroom, where I stood facing them for the first time in years, where my mother rolled her eyes and my father sat smug beside her, believing the system would bend for them, and where Judge Alan Reeves, Grandpa's former clerk, realized exactly who I was. Judge Reeves began the session by glancing down at the documents, then back up at me. Before we proceed, he said, his voice firm but measured, I need to disclose that I clerked under Judge Richard Carter 23 years ago. If either party objects to my presiding, speak now. My parents' attorney, Mr. Collins, leaned over and whispered frantically with them. Laura looked uneasy, but Brian nodded confidently. Finally, Collins stood. No objection, Your Honor. Big mistake. Their opening statement was every cliché I'd ever heard in family court wrapped in fake sympathy. He painted my mother as a devoted daughter, a woman cruelly separated from her loving father by controlling grandparents who turned her child against her. He even had the audacity to say Judge Carter's grief after losing his wife left him vulnerable, easily influenced by those closest to him. I kept my expression still, professional, but my pulse hammered in my throat. Every sentence was a lie built on 30 years of absence. When it was our turn, my attorney, Michael Dunn, rose calmly. Your Honor, this case isn't complicated. Judge Carter was deliberate, brilliant, and lucid until his final day. He left his estate to the one person who consistently showed up, the one who loved him when others couldn't be bothered. The evidence will show that the plaintiffs received over $800,000 from Judge Carter during his lifetime, while visiting him fewer than 10 times in the final decade of his life. Then came the testimonies. Laura took the stand first. She wore conservative black, minimal makeup, her hair pulled into a neat bun. She even brought a handkerchief. Everything about her was rehearsed. He was everything to me, she said softly, daubing at her eyes. When he offered to watch Emily while Brian and I got established, I thought it was temporary, but they kept her. They turned my daughter against me. Michael stood for cross-examination. His tone was steady, surgical. Mrs. Carter, you voluntarily left your daughter when she was 3 months old, correct? Yes, but I was young and struggling. According to your father's calendar, you visited 4 times in her first year. Christmas, Easter, her birthday, and 1 Saturday in July. Is that accurate? I suppose so. Your father also gave you $3,000 monthly for 20 years. That's over $800,000. Yet, according to his own notes, You saw him 8 times in the last 10 years of his life? Does that sound like a devoted daughter to you?" Laura's face flushed. "I had expenses. I was supporting Brian's career." "And when the payments stopped, you stopped visiting. 3 years with no contact, correct?" She stammered something about distance and family tension, but the damage was done. Her performance collapsed under the weight of her own record. Brian's testimony was even worse. He couldn't name a single milestone from my life. Not one. Michael projected photos onto the courtroom screen. "Here's Emily's high school graduation," he said, laser pointer tracing the image. "Front row, Judge Carter. Next to him, Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Where are you, Mr. Carter?" Brian shifted uncomfortably. I might have had a game." "You didn't," Michael replied. "You were in Quincy running a bar that closed 3 months later." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge's expression had softened, not with sympathy, but with quiet disappointment. Mr. Collins tried to recover, but the foundation of his case was already cracked beyond repair. He called a psychiatrist who had never met my grandfather, a man who'd apparently diagnosed him post-mortem with depression based on personality changes mentioned in secondhand statements. Michael dismantled him with surgical precision. "So you diagnosed a Supreme Court justice whom you never met based on 0 medical records and are using that diagnosis to question his competency? Well, in my professional opinion—" "Doctor," Michael interrupted, "your professional opinion appears to be fiction." A quiet laugh rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Reeves allowed the faintest smirk before clearing his throat. Then it was our turn. We called 2 witnesses, Judge Andrew Mitchell, my grandfather's longtime colleague, and Margaret Chen, his estate attorney. Judge Mitchell testified. Richard Carter was as sharp as 87 as he was at 50. He anticipated this exact scenario. He told me, "They'll come for it, but I've left Emily everything she'll need to stand on truth." Margaret Chen confirmed that he had personally reviewed every line of his will 2 years before his death, clear-minded, deliberate, and precise. Finally, it was my turn. Taking the stand, I felt the entire courtroom's eyes on me, my parents included. I'd spent my whole life on this side of justice, but that day, it was personal. Michael led me gently. "Miss Carter, can you describe your relationship with your grandparents?" "They raised me," I said simply. "They showed up when others didn't. Every milestone, every holiday, every dinner, they were there." "And your parents?" "They were absent. Consistently." He nodded. "Did you ever ask your grandfather for money?" "Never. He gave me lessons, not handouts." When it was Colin's turn to cross-examine, his tone dripped with arrogance. "Miss Carter, isn't it true that you manipulated an elderly man for personal gain?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Mr. Collins, if inheritance was my motivation, I wasted a lot of time. I could have built my own wealth instead of spending every Sunday night with an 80-year-old man. But I did it because he mattered. Because love isn't leverage, it's presence, something your clients never understood." The silence afterwards was absolute. Even the sound of the fluorescent lights seemed distant. Judge Reeves gave his verdict less than an hour later. The court finds that the Judge Richard Carter's will reflects his true intentions. There is no evidence of undue influence or incompetence. The plaintiffs demonstrated a consistent pattern of absence. The defendant demonstrated a consistent pattern of care. The will stands as written. Furthermore, attorney fees are awarded to the defendant. The gavel cracked sharply against the desk. Case closed. As I gathered my papers, Laura stood shakily. "Emily, Please, she said, her voice breaking. I'm your mother. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw nothing but history. No, I said quietly. You're the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Evelyn Carter. You had 32 years to show up. You didn't. She started to cry. I walked past her without looking back. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. In the months that followed, the case made quiet headlines across Boston's legal circles. Prosecutor defends her grandfather's will and wins. Colleagues congratulated me. Strangers called me ruthless. But it wasn't ruthlessness. It was closure. Grandpa had given me one last gift, proof that I wasn't wrong. Proof that showing up matters more than blood. That love built on consistency outlasts everything else. 3 years after the trial, I was sworn in as one of the youngest judges in Massachusetts history. 33 years old, standing in the same courthouse where Grandpa once presided. On my first day on the bench, I wore his judicial robe. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of legacy. At 38, I was appointed to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. I sat in the same chamber where he once delivered rulings that shaped the law. The first opinion I ever wrote was about family law. I quoted something Grandpa told me when I was 16. Family isn't who shares your DNA. Family is who shows up when it matters.
5 years after the trial, Laura died. Heart failure. Brian called, asking me to come. I declined. She hadn't been part of my life, and her death didn't change that. 2 years later, he passed as well. I felt nothing. No grief, no anger, just silence. By then, I understood that closure doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means peace. 20 years after Grandpa's death, the state renamed the courthouse in his honor, the Richard Carter Justice Center. I stood at the dedication ceremony, looking up at his portrait hung above the marble steps. He was smiling in that familiar, proud way, the same look he'd given me every Sunday at dinner. When the crowd thinned, I walked up to the front, touched the plaque, and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa. Everything you hoped for. Everything you taught me." Years later, when I finally retired at 60, I visited his grave one last time. The same plot where he and Grandma Evelyn rested side by side under a pair of blooming oak trees. I brought tulip bulbs, the same kind Grandma had been planting the day she died. I knelt, pressing them gently into the soil. "Thank you," I whispered, "for loving me when it wasn't easy, for teaching me what family really means." I brushed the dirt from my hands and stood back, sunlight cutting through the branches overhead. Because here's the truth. Blood may connect you to people, but only love, consistent, ordinary, everyday love, turns that connection into family. That's not just my story. That's justice. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose between toxic blood and real love, share your experience below. And remember, you don't owe loyalty to those who never earned it.